So the presentation I've prepared for you is taken from my book, and obviously I can't share or subject you to all of its contents in this one presentation. It's over 300 pages long. It talks about 20 different films that span 4 different decades, so that is not possible. So keeping in mind the aims of this series and the fact that I'm speaking to an audience that is US-based, I've decided to organize my talk in the following way. So I will spend the first half explaining my theorization of the filmic trope that is the book's main concept and its organizing principle. And then I'm going to just explore one example that centers a star that interfaced with the US and with its racial formation, in addition to being immersed in the Mexican context, which is the primary focus of my work. Okay. When many US and European spectators first encounter mainstream Mexican films and telenovelas, their reaction is frequently one of bewilderment. Often, these spectators cannot help but ask something to the effect of, "Why is everyone so white?" What they mean, of course, is that the predominance of people with European epidermal schemas in film and television produced in Mexico clashes forcefully with their own racialized understanding of Mexicanness, and their often unquestioned acceptance that with respect to themselves, Mexicanness is radical alterity. My book addresses a specific display of the ubiquity of whiteness in Mexico's audiovisual landscape, and one that speaks to the intensity with which the showcasing of whiteness is inextricably tied to colonized notions of beauty and desire. Its historical pervasiveness, even in fiction films that explicitly claim to represent indigeneity. This study builds upon the excellent existing scholarship pointing to the racial politics in Mexican cinema during the Golden Age, which was roughly from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s, a period of film production frequently credited with having a profound impact on Mexican culture and society. Expanding upon the valuable work of scholars such as Joanna Hirschfield, Charles Ramirez-Berg, Andrea Noble, and Dolores Tierney, among many others, this study examines the duration of a local, idiosyncratic form of racial masquerade that I term whiteness as indigeneity. From a decolonial perspective and grounded in the history of race relations in Mexico, this study elucidates how, throughout the Golden Age, the white Indians of Mexican cinema manifest the unresolved tension between two ideological formations. On the one hand was the government's 20th century post-revolutionary discourse. Mexico had a revolution in 1910. Its armed phase lasted until 1920. And then there was a cultural revolution that lasted from 1920 to 1940, right? So on the one hand was the government's 20th century post-revolutionary discourse that symbolically celebrated indigeneity. And on the other was the persistent, long-standing valorization of a local construct of whiteness, which began with colonialism and was transformed through subsequent discourses of modernity during the 19th and 20th centuries. A result of this tension, whiteness as indigeneity is the limit case of the racist norms that have structured audiovisual production in Mexico. Like its hemispheric cousin, blackface, whiteness as indigeneity is characterized by what Stam and Spence have called a tendentiously flawed mimesis. However, instead of seeking to ridicule the racialized subject, the Mexican trope, whiteness as indigeneity, works in the opposite direction, infusing the racialized subject with the dignity and desirability that coloniality confers upon whiteness. The obvious fact that this phenomenon is a breach of indexicality, often a point of contention within many discourses about race and representation in cinema, is not this book's primary focus. In other words, the primary purpose of this book is not merely to point out that the actors playing indigenous people in Mexican cinema are not themselves indigenous people. Rather, this book interrogates the existence of a pervasive racialized visual logic in Mexico that makes this whitening approach to visualizing indigeneity and society in general the rule in the local context, right, independently of the demographic reality. Blatantly distorting demographic reality, right, in very marked ways. The method used here to interrogate this phenomenon, a constant across the periodizations of Mexican cinema, which are typically used to explain stylistic changes, is to critically engage the multiple discursive functions of whiteness in the cinematic representation of indigeneity in Mexico. So now I would like to explain with as much conceptual position as possible what exactly I am talking about when I use the term whiteness. My treatment of whiteness in Mexico refers to a person's ability to locate themselves on the right side of what Walter Mignolo has termed modernity coloniality, the, quote, set of diverse but coherent narratives produced by the Western Christian vision of humanity, complemented by secular degodding narratives of science, economic progress, political democracy, and lately globalization, end of quote. In the Mexican context, modernity coloniality has constructed indigeneity as the bane of these discourses, fixating on the following as points of supposed inferiority in various stages: indigenous paganism, alternative ways of knowing, models of economic subsistence, communal organization, apathy toward the nation state and its supposed democracy, protections for local economies, etc. Furthermore, as Satya P. Mohanty has argued, the process of racialization not only creates stereotypes of the colonized as other and as inferior, the colonizer too develops a cultural identity that survives well past the formal context of colonial rule. In other words, the ongoing process of pejoratively racializing the colonized necessarily also yields the fabrication of a shifting but always privileged category of whiteness defined by its correlation to the current regime of modernity. To name this aspect of whiteness, I borrow and expand a term elaborated by Latin American philosopher Bolívar Echeverría. He uses the term blanquitud. For him, blanquitud refers to an individual's internalization of a specific discourse of whiteness, the puritanical capitalist ethos that values above all else a high degree of productivity and the external material wealth that such productivity yields. For my purposes in this book, blanquitud refers not only to this puritanical capitalist ethos, the current regime of modernity that Echeverría has brilliantly theorized, but also to the previous discourses of Western modernity that have taken root in Mexico, beginning with the Spanish conquest, and which continue to exist in residual forms. In this sense, the discursive and performative dimension of whiteness that I refer to as blanquitud is an aggregate of the discourses of Western modernity in Mexico. At the same time, however, whiteness and indigeneity are not merely discursive or performative positionalities, but ones with a very real embodied component, which imposes limits to performativity for those with racialized epidermal schemas. In order to refer to the quality of having genealogical ties to Europe and an epidermal schema that is read as European, this book uses the term blancura. So obviously I'm using words in Spanish. I'm just going to take this moment to highlight the fact that it's important to know other languages because, obviously in English, we just have the word whiteness, and so people who want to talk about whiteness, it gets capitalized, it gets quotes, it gets, single. Knowing more languages and working across languages, you have the advantage of sort of splitting the concept with different words, right? So blancura, blanquitud, and some people also talk about blanquedad in general, right, to talk about whiteness that encompasses both of these things. So I use blancura and blanquitud. Okay. The position of whiteness as the norm, which this is the idea, Richard Dyer's idea, when he's talking about the US and Europe, right? So this representation of whiteness as the norm in Mexican film and media is particularly perverse in light of the country's majority mestizo demography. So mestizo just traditionally refers to indigenous and Spanish mixture. And of course, more recently, as there has been a recognition of the Afro-descendant populations. Right now, it does include that, but traditionally in the period I'm talking about, that was not included in the term, right? So in light of the country's majority mestizo demography, the degree of mediatic distortion carried out by this norm and the virulence with which it is defended confers upon Mexican film and media's privileging of whiteness a unique ideological force that this book uncovers. That ideological force is the coloniality of power, and more specifically, dynamics that I refer to as the colonization of desire and subjectivity. When discussing the Black Antillean, So when discussing the Black Antillean woman's desire to couple with a white man, Fanon suggests that, I apologize. First we have to go to the first part of Fanon. Okay, so in his well-known 1952 text, Black Skin, White Masks, Frantz Fanon suggests that the prohibition of sexual relations and marriage between black men and white women during the colonial period in the Antilles caused black men to experience desire toward the white woman because an intimate relationship with the white woman came to symbolize both redress for colonial subjugation and acceptance within white society. When discussing the Black Antillean woman's desire to couple with the white man, Fanon suggests that the inclination is rooted in a wish to whiten and therefore improve the prospects for future children. He also suggests that marrying a white man is a way to definitively disassociate oneself from Blackness and approach a more consolidated and convincing white identity. In a similar vein, Albert Memmi's book, The Colonizer and the Colonized, highlights the desire to marry the colonizer as an extension of the colonized's strategy to become like his oppressor by adopting everything from the colonizer's world as superior. Both Fanon and Memmi reveal that in colonial and post-colonial contexts, sexual attraction and desire are far from arbitrary occurrences and can be understood as racialized phenomena. Of course, I do not mean that the colonized are never considered to be sexually desirable, but that the overwhelming tendency to exalt whiteness as desirable in these contexts has a basis in colonial subjugation. Furthermore, as Fanon and Memmi argue, the way in which colonialism upholds the colonizer's body as more desirable contributes to a process of self-loathing in the colonized, and this fact is evidenced in various attempts at physical whitening alongside the broader processes of socioeconomic and cultural whitening. While the history of interracial marriage in Mexico has its own historical specificities, and I go through them in the book, I can't do it here, the experience of colonialism produced similar results to those described by Fanon and Memmi. This racialized discourse, the racialized desire for white bodies has been documented throughout the history of Mexican cultural production. Mexican cinema, television programs, and advertisements reinforce the supposed aesthetic superiority and desirability of whites to this day. Although I do not exclude that Mexican films have also sought to imitate the conventions of whiteness in European and American films, what I wish to point out is that because beautiful bodies and faces are almost always requirements for film stars, especially for women, whiteness in Mexican film production has also been predominant because of the local process of colonization of desire, which dictates that beauty is white according to a very specific set of bodily standards within the context of the local racial formation. So Fanon also describes how the colonized subject's exposure to racialized discourses in comic books and history books impacts him, effectively alienating him from himself through a kind of discursive brainwashing, the colonization of his subjectivity. He identifies with the white protagonist, the victor, and becomes complicit in the othering of pejoratively racialized subjects. He therefore associates the Senegalese with the, quote, wicked Negroes, Fanon's words, of his text, and attributes to himself a white subjectivity, disavowing his own African ancestry. Fanon's identification of how the colonized are coerced to identify with whiteness not only is a characteristic of the Antilles, but also is constitutive of the coloniality of power across colonies. In the Mexican context, the colonial experience similarly created a cultural symbolic order that, for example, through historical and religious narrative, supported whiteness as a preferred signifier of privileged social identity. This cultural symbolic order was not entirely replaced or eliminated through independence, revolution, or the revolution's institutionalized cultural projects. So the juxtaposition of these two images in many ways represents the ideological tension that is the starting point for this book, right? So, of course, many of you in this room are probably familiar with Diego Rivera. His work is very much emblematic of the Cultural Revolution. Here we have, a representation of Rivera's trinity of the soldier, the peasant campesino, and the worker, right? And so he, in many ways, exalts a physical manifestation of the country that during the 30-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and prior to that dictatorship were not predominantly sort of celebrated in the country's visual culture quite in this way. And in many ways, the Mexican government was very successful in disseminating these ideas and also exporting them, right, to the US, kind of creating this idea that sort of everybody was on board with this new way of representing the country. And what you have on the other sort of side of the slide is a cartoon that I found in a newspaper. I think the date is, I can't see from here, but it's early 20th century, contemporary to this image. And what you see in this cartoon is an indigenous woman with her child going to a child's beauty contest, and the judge asks her basically, what are you doing here? Why did you bring this hideous child? And she says, well, Don Diego Rivera is one of the judges of the contest. And he basically responds, well, like, what does that have to do with anything, right? So the cartoon basically gets at the fact that, yes, there was this sort of state-sponsored project. At the same time, that doesn't mean that everybody instantaneously thought that indigenous people were all of a sudden extremely beautiful and deserved to be sort of exalted through aesthetic mediums, right? Yes, okay. So instead, these movements, and I'm referring to revolution and the revolution's cultural project, instead these movements merely qualified the terms of white superiority through subsequent discourses of modernity. Although Mexican historian José Jorge Gómez Izquierdo does not refer to Fanon, his own study of how Mexican history books teach about indigenous cultures bring him to a similar conclusion. Their discourses serve the purposes of white supremacy in Mexico, aligning the pupil with the non-indigenous subject, which results in psychological and emotional damage. In light of a history of highly racialized social attitudes, I suggest that whiteness, blancura, so the physical manifestation, is also dominant in Mexican cultural production and in Mexican cinema specifically, because in the context of colonized subjectivity, physical whiteness functions as a device for inciting identification between the spectator and the main characters in the diegeses, or story worlds. Right? So it's not about indexicality, right? It's about interpolating, right? Leading roles, the primary point of identification for audiences in narrative cinema, are therefore almost exclusively played by actors who can conform to the physical boundaries of Mexican whiteness. And this is especially true in the realm of melodrama, because it is a mode of representation that requires identification in order to produce pathos. Leading roles, the primary point of identification for audiences in narrative cinema, are, right, they're played by this sort of physical profile. Furthermore, blancura functions as a kind of passport for aspiring media figures because, according to the logic of the colonization of subjectivity, physical whiteness qualifies them as deserving of centrality and attention. In this way, several stars in Mexico and throughout the Americas, who originally lacked substantive blanquitud, right, were able to capitalize on and enhance their blancura while presenting their lower class affinity as charm or relatability, allowing them to rise to prominence in still racist societies. Figures who have benefited from playing this whiteness game include Pedro Infante in Mexico, Eva Perón in Argentina, Carmen Miranda in Brazil, and Marilyn Monroe in the United States. Specifically, within story worlds dealing with non-elite sectors of society, whiteness functions as the colonially determined glue that allows a broad sector of Mexican society to identify with and desire characters who have stigmatized social identities, because whiteness interpolates and appeals to spectators on the basis of their shared colonized desire and subjectivity. Or, to put it another way, the whitening of marginalized social sectors in Mexican melodrama is their visual resemanticization through the hegemonic code, and that's the phrasing of a Latin American communications scholar, Jesus Martín Barbero, according to which white bodies are valuable and desirable. If, as Mexican anthropologist Roger Bartra has argued, a specific formula is needed to produce the transposition of some selected aspects of lower class struggles and feelings to the domain of national culture, then I argue that with regard to Mexican cinema and media, whiteness is that formula's key ingredient. For instance, it is through whiteness that a representative of the urban working class, Pepe el Toro, played by Pedro Infante in the 1948 film Nosotros los Pobres, becomes one of the most cherished characters in all of Mexican film history. This was the most frequently screened film in Mexico in the 20th century. It is also through whiteness that melodramatic indigeneity works to endear itself to spectators through the faces of stars such as Dolores del Rio and Maria Felix, among many others. While scholars have already observed the ways in which film production from the Golden Age fulfilled a hegemonic role, helping to fashion Mexican spectators into national subjects, it bears mentioning that indigenous-themed films in particular were charged with specific meanings and missions because of the significance of cinema as a medium that was uniquely associated with modernity. International recognition of Mexican films was one way in which, after the revolution, after the revolution, the nation sought to proclaim its arrival as a sophisticated peer among North American and Western European countries. And you have to keep in mind that the Mexican Revolution was one of the first conflicts to be captured on film in its entirety, and broadcast throughout the world. And so that did not do many favors to Mexico's reputation, right? So post-war cinema is trying to sort of mitigate a lot of those impressions, right? So through their participation in the modern art form of cinema, Mexican filmmakers sought to be recognized in international contexts as producers of films that were both exemplars of artistic quality and identifiably Mexican. Mexican films about indigeneity are therefore rich spaces in which the search for Mexican singularity and external recognition, the racialized associations between indigeneity and backwardness, and the national aspirations to be modern are carefully negotiated. But to which iteration of modernity does this white Mexican body masqueraded as indigenous correspond? When tasked with representing an indigeneity that is both modern and desirable, 20th century cultural producers resort to using the visage of the first project of Western modernity introduced in what is now Mexico, an Iberian physical schema. By this point, Iberianness was sufficiently inscribed in local society and displaced from a global hegemonic position, having become the decayed alter ego of Anglo-US imperialism after 1898, so as to be associated with Mexican tradition vis-a-vis looks disseminated from Western Europe and the United States. At the same time, a physical appearance that connoted Iberianness was still superior to the indigenous physical schemata within a Eurocentric worldview. For this reason, and the Iberian physical schemata, the darkest variant of Mexican whiteness, became the canvas of choice onto which indigeneity could be layered on through folkloric embellishment. This visual code will define whiteness as indigeneity in cinema throughout the 20th century, with many white Mexican actresses transforming themselves physically into indigenous characters simply by wearing long, dark braids. Of course, it is important to keep in mind that the stars who would embody Mexican whiteness on screen were able to do so because they conformed to the contextual and ambiguous nature of Mexican whiteness. As other scholars have already observed, many of these same actors, such as Lupe Vélez and Dolores del Rio, and I'll be talking about Vélez later as the example, they were cast as ethnic others within Hollywood's distinct Anglo-American Protestant construct of whiteness. According to Richard Dyer, within Hollywood's racial framework, Latin whites are more sexual and prone to, quote, anything that can be characterized as low, dark, and thank you, I cannot get it out, corporeal, right? So linked to the body, lower debased instincts, right? In this sense, during their US careers, Vélez and Del Rio operated as incarnations of what Maria de Guzman has called off-whiteness, in referring to the liminal positionality that Spaniards and their descendants in the Americas occupy within the US racial formation and cultural imagination, precisely because they incarnate a deposed project of empire and modernity vis-a-vis that of the US after 1898. Regarding indigenous-themed films, Mexican whiteness as indigeneity is an instance in which, as Ana M. Lopez has articulated when writing about the representation of women in Golden Age cinema, conflicting voices and needs visibly erupt into the cinematic and social sphere. Whiteness as indigeneity functions as a solution to an aesthetic challenge raised by the shift in official ideology regarding Mexican national identity after the revolution. Whiteness as indigeneity operates as a palimpsest of discourses. Beneath are the racialized vestiges of the colonial symbolic order that have not been entirely erased by the revolution and continue to privilege whiteness. Above is a new state-sponsored discourse urging Mexicans to value indigenous people and peasants as worthy national subjects and as part of the country's cultural revolution, right? Or, to use the vocabulary of Raymond Williams, we're seeing the relationship between the residual and the emergent. In this way, the use of whiteness for representing indigeneity operates as a hegemonic maneuver and sophisticated, colonially inflected semiotic trick, intended to facilitate a national and personal appropriation of indigeneity precisely through the continued glorification of whiteness as understood and constructed in the local context. Through racial masquerade, whiteness as indigeneity is a tool for impelling spectators toward varied ideological positions regarding the place of the native in national culture. So we're going to move to just one example, okay? So this is from chapter 2, which is titled Taming the Tijuana. And so Tehuantepec, the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, is that sort of narrow land mass that you see right there in southern Mexico. So Tehuanas are women from this place, right? Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the women of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec drew attention from both international visitors to the region and domestic cultural figures. Historian Ajit Lewis has noted that cultural production from both centuries participate in the creation of what she calls the camposcape, an idealization of the countryside as a site of national authenticity, origin, and beauty, in which the Tehuana emerged as an ambiguous figure who embodied seduction, unbridled female sexuality, independence, beauty, and strength, but also represented the soul of southern indigena Mexico. Mexican cinema's golden age representation of the Tehuana, therefore, had to contend with a pre-existing mythology about the regional type that contained elements that were at odds with the conventions of ideal womanhood in mid-20th century filmic melodrama. As Lopez reminds us, Mexican cinema produced between the 30s and 50s was family entertainment, by design and by commercial imperatives broader based. This required, among other things, a careful management of the representation of sexuality and desire. So here I explore how one Tehuana-themed film created within the commercial and industrial thrust of the Golden Age, La Sandunga, which is a song that is from this region, directed by Fernando de Fuentes in 1938, tempers aspects of this type's earlier representation to generate a non-threatening cinematic regional type for broad consumption. In the process of refashioning, Mexican whiteness plays a key role in the creation of a Tehuana that functions as a desirable woman, physically and romantically, and as a compelling melodramatic character in the local context. La Sandunga takes place in the town of San Lorenzo in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and tells the story of a young Tehuana, Lupe, played by the star Lupe Vélez. She, at this point, had already become successful in the United States. So this character, she's in love with a sailor from the city of Veracruz, who is played by Arturo de Córdoba. He later becomes a very famous actor. The film's dramatic tension revolves around a local endogamous custom dictating that Tehuanas cannot couple with men who are not from the town, which threatens Lupe and Juancho's union. When Juancho leaves to make money so that the two can get married, another local man courts her. Fearing that she's been abandoned, Lupe succumbs to the pressure from her friends and family and agrees to marry Ramon. However, Juancho manages to return in the nick of time to reunite with Lupe. And of course, that phrase, in the nick of time, is, of course, very central to melodrama theory, because melodrama is all about the tension between too late and in the nick of time, right? Okay. La Sandunga's camposcape visualizes the Tehuana through whiteness as indigeneity, particularly through the on-screen presence of the film's protagonist, Lupe, played by the star actress Lupe Vélez. In order to unpack the layers of meaning at work in Vélez's interpretation of this role, one must consider the nature of her star persona in Mexico. Working in Hollywood starting in the late 1920s, Vélez was sometimes treated as a problematic incarnation of Mexican womanhood by the Mexican press in relation to traditional norms regarding class, gender, and the appropriate performance of Mexican identity. Her behavior was perceived as being characteristic of the lower class, vulgar, and indicating a lack of culture. This characterization was even more prominent when compared to Dolores del Rio, a contemporary Mexican actress also working in Hollywood, whose star text associated her with aristocracy, refinement, and morality. Furthermore, the Mexican press accused Vélez of being unfavorably Americanized and therefore unpatriotic. Finally, Vélez challenged traditional gender norms for women in Mexico, embracing independence and sexual freedom, due to which she was cast as a negative influence on Mexican women. Although Lupe Vélez was criticized on many fronts, she still possessed an important form of capital that allowed her to work both in Hollywood and in Mexico and be considered a beauty icon in her home country. Vélez had a physical appearance that was coded as white in Mexico, blancura, even if she did not originally possess some of the aspects of a white socio-economic identity in Mexico, blanquitud, such as affluence and an aristocratic pedigree, as was the case with Del Rio. In addition to her physical blancura, Vélez's successful film career in Hollywood did imbue her with another form of blanquitud, the type that Bolívar Echeverría understands as productivity and wealth derived from participation in capitalist production wedded to modern technology. The following advertisement, which appears in the newspaper El Universal Ilustrado on June 13, 1929, illustrates the centrality of Vélez's white identity, blancura, and her connection to the motion picture industry, blanquitud, for the purpose of selling a beauty cream in Mexico. The text of the advertisement makes clear that Vélez is a model of beauty because of her skin color. It also casts Lupe's endorsement of the product within a national framework by mentioning that the cream protects her complexion in the different environments within the Mexican Republic, keeping it, quote, deliciously white, fresh, and youthful. Furthermore, the fact that here Vélez appears wearing nothing but a Spanish shawl hints that her Mexican whiteness may be linked to Spanish origins, or at the very least, that it allows her to carry off a Spanish look. By emphasizing that Vélez possessed light skin, right, which Joanne Hirschfeld has analyzed as a mark of feminine beauty in Mexico, in a manner that also inscribes her as a Mexican national subject with potential ties to Spanishness, the advertisement reveals that although in the US, Vélez was constructed as an ethnic other against the US WASP notion of whiteness, in her home country, she was able to participate in white Mexican womanhood and profit from its privileges. The fact that Vélez's whiteness is a component of her attractiveness and stardom would seemingly conflict with the parameters of the role she plays in La Sandunga, in which the actress is meant to incarnate an exotic Southern and indigenous Mexican woman. However, instead of merely focusing on the ideas of incompatibility and conflict, I argue that Lupe's whiteness as indigeneity functions as a hegemonic maneuver meant to impel Mexican spectators toward the admiration and emotional connection to a regional type in order to nationalize the Tijuana. La Sandunga produces the protagonist's whiteness as indigeneity in multiple ways. Among them, the protagonist's embodied on-screen presence closely follows classic studio cinema's visual parameters for leading female characters. Lupe appears in the form of a tall, slender body with light skin, large eyes, full makeup, made-up lashes, visible eyeshadow, thin manicured eyebrows, and lipstick. And this is what Ajith Lewis has called the deco body, right? The character's indigeneity is layered on through folkloric costume, hairstyles, and through a peppering of Spanish anachronisms in her speech. Furthermore, on multiple occasions, the film produces Lupe's to-be-looked-atness, right, Mulvey's term, her to-be-looked-atness through three-point lighting and the use of the soft focus lens, which at key moments makes her entire head appear to radiate light. In this sense, La Sandunga deploys the convention through which, according to Richard Dyer, cinema has visually idealized white female beauty. As he explains, throughout the history of film, quote, idealized white women are bathed and permeated by light. It streams through them and it falls on them from above. In short, they glow. The light within or above appears to suffuse the body. So you might be asking, like, why is she subjecting us to this minutia about, like, the image? But so if we think about, like, cinematography, right, from the Greek literally means to write with light. So light is fundamental. We need to understand how light is working to glorify certain bodies, promote certain bodies, right? Okay, so Lupe's whiteness, as glorified by studio-era lighting conventions, is a manifestation of racist beauty standards for women in commercial Mexican cinema. Furthermore, her whiteness functions as the key factor through which La Sandunga manifests the Tijuana, not only as a beautiful ornament, which is the way in which indigenous women had been photographed since the 19th century, but also as a worthy object of aesthetic and romantic desire for a broad Mexican audience. Okay. La Sandunga also modifies other aspects of the Tijuana's characterization and cultural production from the 19th and 20th centuries, such as her supposed casual attitudes toward nudity and sexuality. For instance, the costumes that the actresses playing Tijuanas wear in the film appear to be inspired by 19th century version of local dress made according to Victorian and Porphyrian fashion sensibilities, which include European lace, ruffles, petticoats, and velvet. The modest nature of the regional vestment presented in the film contrasts greatly with various earlier representations of Tijuana clothing, including Claudio Linati's 1830 lithograph of the regional type, which, as you can see, is quite transparent. Journalist Cube Bonifant's 1921 description of the Tijuana's, quote, dark skin, fresh and throbbing under clear silks and pale ribbons showing through their white transparent trajes, end of quote. and Sergey Eisenstein, the Soviet director, Sergey Eisenstein's display of a bare-breasted Tijuana lounging outdoors with complete nonchalance in his 1932 film, Que Viva Mexico. In particular, the scene in which a fully dressed Lupe lounges on a hammock invites comparisons with the one in which Concepcion in Eisenstein's film similarly rests outside, but nude from the waist up. Most likely, the cinematic depiction of the Tijuana's scanty traditional dress would have been considered scandalous, especially on a white Mexican actress. And in the book, I go into the ways in which white female nudity is considered pornographic at this time, but that is not necessarily the case for non-white women. I can't go into it here, but it's there. And almost certainly would have hampered the distribution and exhibition of a commercial film, like La Sandunga. By opting for a modest version of Tijuana dress, the film tempers the regional type for the broadest possible commercial consumption, while still referencing some of the aspects of the previously established iconography used to represent her. So I'm just going to put forth one final thought as by way of conclusion. This attenuated Golden Age representation of the Tijuana follows a similar pattern to that of Mario Moreno's version of the urban lumpen proletariat male type, El Pelado. Critics and scholars have demonstrated how Moreno's character, Cantinflas, incrementally revised the Pelado, transforming his meaning in the national cultural imaginary from one of a potential threat to being one of the best-loved representatives of Mexican identity at home and abroad. La Sandunga similarly refashions the Tijuana, creating a version of the regional type that is compatible with patriarchal, racist, and nationalist values. And in so doing, the film illustrates how cinema participated in the extraction and transformation of the regional figure into a less controversial national symbol. Okay, that is all. Thank you so much.